Hello everyone, it is time for a rant, and this time it's going to be something which I believe will be quite controversial, because I know there's going to be so many people out there who disagree with what I have to say, but as a little disclaimer, I'm just going to say that I know that this is going to be a bit controversial. It's going to stir up some emotions with some people. So what I'm going to say is, first of all, hear me out, listen to what I have to say the whole way through, and then make your comment after that. Don't just, comment telling me I'm wrong, like, without watching the video, because you might think that I'm trying to imply something which I'm not. Because there are certain things that could be implied by my conclusion here, but I am not implying those things, and I'll explain what I mean when I get to that. I am not really an advocate for DLC as a whole. DLC is basically, if you don't know what it is, I'll explain. Say you buy a game and you play the game. Now, DLC is where you pay extra money and then you can get extra content for that game. So, say you've got a game that you really enjoy, you can then choose to buy maybe an extra level or extra characters and then use them. And if you don't want to do this, you don't have to. You don't have to buy these extra characters or these extra levels or these extra content. Whatever the content may be, you have the choice whether to buy them or not. Is it a good choice to have? Well, it depends. In most cases, I think not really. But I'll get to that later. The main controversy here is about the location of where the DLC is. Usually you can have two types of DLC. You can have on-disc DLC and off-disc DLC, although people don't say off-disc DLC, they just say DLC. But on-disc DLC generally gets a lot of hate because there's a lot of things that people associate with on-disc DLC. And if you don't know what they are, I'll explain what they mean. So, off-disc DLC, which I think is the majority of DLC, it's where you have the game, and if you want the extra content, you can download it from whatever service you are using, PlayStation Network, Xbox Live, or Steam, or whatever, and you download the file of that content, and it goes to your account, and now when you play the game, you can then load up that file when you're playing the game, and you can access that content. On-disc DLC is different in the sense that the content itself isn't online. You don't download the content. The content is actually on the disc. And what you download is a very small file that will allow your account to gain access to the content that is on the disc. So you might have a disc of, I'm just making up numbers here, but you might have a disc and it's got 5 gigabytes of a game, and then maybe 500 megabytes is 500 of those megabytes is actually locked out, so the game itself is 4.5 gigabytes, and then you download like a 2 kilobyte file, and then all of a sudden you have access to that other 500 megabytes. The question is, which one of these systems is better, and should we even be comparing these two systems? A lot of people, I think a lot of people think that they believe that they should be compared, but I think they should be compared, but I also think that a lot of people, when coming to the conclusion of what they think about on-disc DLC, they don't actually make that comparison, even though they think that they do. There are some basic and minor advantages and disadvantages, and these are things that have already been mentioned, so I'll just run through them. And this isn't really like the meat of what I'm trying to say, this isn't like the meat of my conclusion, but I'm just going to address them anyway. The advantages to having it on the disc, well, for one, it means that the download is going to be smaller. You only have to download a few kilobytes rather than megabytes or even gigabytes of content, so it's faster. It also fills up your hard drive space less because you're not having to download as much. So there's that advantage there. There's also the case that if you are, for example, fighting against someone on a fighting game, and you are fighting them and they are using a character that is DLC, if it's on the disc, then your game can still access the part of the disc that will allow them to still use that character. Whereas if it's the DLC is not on the disc, then what you are doing is you'd have to, like, say, download a patch so that you can then still fight them. So there's those few advantages for the on-disc DLC there. There's a disadvantage to the... there is a disadvantage to the on-disc DLC, which I think no one's really touched on, but I think is a point to be made, even though it might not be that good of a point. And I think one of the disadvantages is the fact that this takes up space on the disc. It might not be the case it takes up space on the hard drive, but it does take up space on the disc. Now, if you're, say, using certain types of... say if you're using a Blu-ray disc, then this is likely not a problem at all. And even on DVD discs, this probably isn't even a problem. Unless, say, you are, using a big game that takes up most of the disc. So it actually, takes space away from the disc, so you might have to actually have more than one disc because of this. It's not likely, but it's a point that's possible, and I think no one's brought it up. No, I've never heard anyone bring it up, but I do think it's a point. So why do people hate on-disc DLC? And I've heard people make analogies, and I don't agree with the analogies, but the thing that people say about on-disc DLC is that when you buy a game, you buy the disc. Because you've bought the disc, you should therefore have access to everything that's on the disc. Right. I don't necessarily agree with this. I don't think it's fair to say that you should have everything on the disc, because even though disc size is quantifiable, content on disc might not necessarily be quantifiable. For example, what is a game? Well, we can look at things that are games and how much content they have, and there is no defined set amount of memory usage that we have to say, okay, it's a game if it's so much, or it's not a game if it's too much. There isn't that threshold. So Pong, for example, is a game, just as much as Skyrim is a game. Now, of course, Skyrim has a lot more content, and it has a lot more graphics, and a lot more power, and it has a lot more requirements, and all that. But if we're talking basic theory about what a game is, they are both games, and they are both equally games. They both share the same identity as a game. And sheer quantity of memory that's been used on a disc doesn't necessarily indicate value. You could have, and again I'm just using an example here, you could have an audio disc which is an hour of white noise, and you could have an audio disc of 10 minutes of music that people enjoy, and the white noise is going to take up more space because, it's longer. I'm not going to go into technical details about how much hertz and things use and all that, because I'm not too familiar, but I think I'm making my point clear here. So we can't judge the quantity or the gameness of a game by how much memory is being used, nor can we judge how good the game is based on how much memory is used. There can be very good games out there that run on old hardware. So if we think of PlayStation 1 discs, right? What is considered a good game? Or even cartridges. Nintendo 64. Let's talk about The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. It's often considered the best game ever. I don't personally think it is, but the point is that it's often considered the best game ever. And you might have a game that takes up lots of memory, and you could hate it. It might be terrible. It might just be loads of graphics, and it's not really entertaining. It's just designed to be completely graphical. Of course, these are pretty two extremes. So when we judge the quality of a game, we are not considered, or we are not concerned about the actual memory size. And another thing to mention is that not only is all this true, but also when you buy a game, its price depends on its age, and its age doesn't necessarily correlate so much to how much memory's on the disc. You can find a PS3 game from not too long ago, and it will be at a very much a discounted price just because it's been out for a few years. And it's not necessarily that the newer PS3 games are using more memory space, because maybe they're not. So trying to make this connection between money that you spend as a ratio to how much memory you get of content that you can have access to, it doesn't work. Some people, and you could say rightfully so, will be happy spending a lot of money on an old but rare and fun game. So, if this is the case, why are we complaining, or why are people complaining about relative size? I think all those points I've just made is basically leading up to this big conclusion here that when we buy a game, it's the content that we care about. It's what is the content that we're getting for the money, and how much we're going to enjoy that content, and for how long. That is the primary concern of people when they buy games. Now, of course, you might be someone who really enjoys good graphics. You might really want a realistic game, and fair enough. But if, say, a realistic game you made good use of memory in the fact that it didn't use all that much but still looked really realistic, I don't think you would really care that it doesn't take up that much space. I mean, to be quite honest, people would rather a game come on one disc than 4 or 3. It's just basic. Even though sometimes if a game's good enough, long enough, or just got enough content, then we can accept that it comes on more than one disc. And that's fair, that's fine. So why are we making these judgments about a percentage? Why do we care about getting 100% of what's on the thing when we pay? And if we end up getting 95% of that, why are we so angry, or I don't want to say we because I'm not included in this, but why do people get so angry and upset that they're getting a lower percentage even though they still might be getting something that's very cost efficient, very cost worthy, and something that's very enjoyable to them? That's something I don't understand. If you take 95% of a 50GB dual-laid Blu-ray disc and you're annoyed at the 95% of that, and you still have a game that can last you hundreds of hours, why would you complain that you can't have access to that extra bit? It still is a lot of it still would be good for the money that you pay. Got an analogy for you to try to describe, or further describe, what this is. Say if you are buying ice cream, right? You're buying an ice cream, and you can get a single cone for, I'm just making up numbers here, so I've no idea how much ice cream costs. When was the last time I bought an ice cream? I don't actually, now that I think about it, I don't know if I have, myself, has ever bought an ice cream. That's strange to think. But anyway, say, and again, making up numbers, the actual numbers don't matter, right? You buy an ice cream, single cone, for 50p, using UK money here, because I come from the UK, so I'm using British pounds in my analogy here. You buy a single cone and it's 50p. Or you can buy two for 90p, and if you buy those two for 90p, then you also get this blob of ice cream extra in this sealed box that you can't open. Unless you pay, I don't know, a pound more. I know I'm not scaling this very well, but the idea here is that when it comes to value for money, I mean, sure, you might just want the one cone, but if you want the two cones, then, spend the 90p. Don't spend the 50p twice, because then you're paying more. And the fact that there's this extra ice cream scoop thing in a box that you would have to pay extra for, it doesn't matter, because what you are getting in relation to how much you pay is still a good quantifiable thing. And if you really wanted this extra scoop, this extra flavour, whatever it is, for another pound, then you can do that. Now notice that I'm using a very specific analogy here, because this is an example where it is directly more cost efficient if you go for the option with this on-disc DLC, so to speak. In this metaphorical on-disc DLC version of ice cream. Of course, there's another example of that whereby you have where the two scooped ice cream costs £2 and you still get this box. Then, in that's going to be a situation whereby it is more cost effective again to get two of the smaller of the one coned ones, because it works out cheaper overall. So when we're talking about price and what you're getting, I'm basically saying that I think it's wrong to judge as a percentage of what you're getting, because there's no defined size of a game, there's no defined memory size of what's enjoyable. It's very variable. There's no very specific price that you need to pay based on these other variables. So working as a percentage really doesn't work. So I think I've made that point there is about as clear as I can make it. And if people continue to say at this point that you're still missing part, you're still getting the disc without everything on it, if you own the disc you should have everything on it, re-watch that part, re-listen, and think about, is it cost effective? But I have to also make some things clear here as well, like I said I would have to. Am I advocating on-disc DLC? Not particularly, and the reason for that is that I don't particularly advocate DLC as a whole. The only point I'm really trying to prove here is that on-disc DLC is not inherently worse than off-disc DLC. I think the problem is with DLC is that it's a very psychological trick that the developers, or publishers or whoever it is, can make when they decide to charge extra for other parts of the game. It's designed such a way that you would pay overall more money for less content as a whole. That's the way that it's designed. It's designed to get money from you. Of course, if it didn't work, they wouldn't do it. So these systems are designed to take the money from you. So I don't think that DLC... I think DLC is abused because of that. But that's not the point I'm trying to make. I'm trying to say that DLC, as a concept, if it was used in a way that was more cost-effective, it could work out, and it could be a really good thing for the players. And I just think that it's a system that's used to play psychological tricks on people in order to get them to pay more. What type of psychological tricks am I talking about? Well, first of all, there's the whole thing about them tempting you the whole time, saying like, "Oh, you can't go this way because you don't have this DLC." And the fact that you've already got the game and that you've already earned things in the game makes the fact that the extra content will have a different sort of value to you because you've worked towards something that would help you get through that extra content. So there are these like psychological tricks that they use for DLC. But I think as a business model, as it stands, DLC could work fine. Of course, the other thing about DLC is, like with downloadable games in general, is that once you've bought it, you can't resell it. So you're stuck with it on your account and you don't have any flexibility. I think that should be reflected in the price, which I think Steam sales are good for. In that you know that you can't resell it, but at the same time, even though you know you can't resell it, you still feel that the value that you do get is worth it because, you know, Fallout New Vegas for £3, you know, that's a lot cheaper than like 20 in the shops on the console or however much it is. So yeah, there is that. And I think that one of the things a lot of people don't like about on-disc DLC is that when you... What was I going to say? Is that when you have a game with on-disc DLC, and this goes back to what I was saying quite far back earlier on, is that people think they're making the comparison about the different types of DLC, but they're not. Because the claim that they're trying to make is that they think they should get that extra content, or, I mean, you know, don't have a go at me for using the word extra, let's not have an argument about semantics here. But people feel that if that content is on the disc, then you should get it when you buy the game. But when developers and publishers make this decision to put content on disc DLC on the disc, what they are not doing is they are not saying, should we do this or should we give them it for free? Or not free. Again, sorry. I need to word myself better here. I don't mean free. I mean, they don't think should we make them pay extra for this, or should we just give them the game as it is? And I think the thing is, I think that when it comes to pricing in general, I think that prices are pretty bad because when you think, and I know everyone's opinion is different, but I think when you look at the quality of games and you look at the price of them, price is very much determined by age. If a game's just come out, it'll be a lot more expensive. For example, earlier today I saw Dynasty Warriors 8 for £45, and don't get me wrong, I am a fan of the Dynasty Warriors game, the Dynasty Warriors series, and the spin-offs of the Dynasty Warriors series, other than Empires, but the pricing of that game is very much determined by the age of the game, the fact that it's brand new. I wouldn't spend £45 on a Dynasty Warriors game. It's that type of series where I know that, even though I do like the games and I know that I do enjoy the games, it's the series where I know what the business model is like. I know that they are going to make a Dynasty Warriors 9, and I know that not too much is going to change. So it can kind of people feel like they're being ripped off, but this feeling, I think, really should be with all sorts of different types of games from different types of pricing schemes for all sorts of different types of reasons, like, is the game old? And if the game is old, it'll probably be cheaper, and in some cases more expensive if it's a rare and sought after game. But I think that when people do this, I think they're kind of missing the point. And everything, it's very hard for me to... It's very hard for me to try to explain, because I'm trying to bundle everything that I've said together into a single coherent sentence, and it's so hard to do because there's so many things to consider, like the pricing of like how old it is, and there are some games that come out these days full price that are terrible, that you wouldn't dare buy. I think one example, and I can't say I've never played the game, but Dark Void, wasn't that meant to be terrible? And wasn't that like full price when it came out like every other game? So if you're going to talk and complain about companies ripping you off, I think the focus shouldn't necessarily be on the method of which they are ripping you off, but rather how much they're ripping you off by. And I think £45 for Dynasty Warriors 8 is a rip-off, even though I know that I'll most likely enjoy the game because I'm a fan of the series. So, basically what I'm saying is, do I think the on-disc DLC is good? I'm repeating myself. Right, one point that I didn't, or did I mention? I can't remember. It's getting so long-winded now that I can't remember what I've said and what I haven't said. But when they are considering about whether the DLC should be on the disc or not, what they are comparing are the options of it being on disc and it being off disc. So really you should compare the two DLC models. Like, would it be better for me as a consumer for this content to be on the disc or off the disc? Because it's more than likely that what they're doing is they have planned that this content is going to be extra that you have to pay extra for. But it's a case of, are they going to how are they going to present that to me? If you're getting it on the disc, it doesn't make sense to me to complain that it shouldn't be DLC at all, but then if it's off the disc, be perfectly fine with the fact that it is DLC. Because at the end of the day, DLC is DLC, and if you are paying extra for extra content, and if the content's valuable or not, then that's the thing that should be an issue. And judging a game by the value of the percentage of the disc or the percentage of whatever it is that you're getting, that you have access to from what you're getting, doesn't actually weigh up, because there are all sorts of different types of variables that go into the different prices of games, such as how old it is a very big deciding factor. And there are new games that are really high priced that are terrible, and again it all comes down to opinion, and there are games that are really cheap and quite old that just could be your favourite game ever. It's such a small part of the pricing scheme that it doesn't really fit that deeply into the bigger picture, and really what you should be thinking about is the price. And even if you were to consider the DLC as a part of a rip-off, don't think of it as they've made this DLC as opposed to not making it DLC, because as a business model, it's not DLC or not, it's on disc or off disc. And given between those two options, I can't necessarily think of much of a good reason why off disc would be better. Of course, there is the advantage about off disc, the fact that it gives them more time to work at it, and they can release it after the release of the game, so they can judge on like statistics of how people have done and what people like to do, and they can balance it a bit more, I guess. But I think I've made a pretty good case, and despite me saying that I don't think I could wrap it all up, I think I just did. So, yeah, don't hate me for saying what I've just said. I'm not a supporter of DLC in general because of how the system is abused, but I think I've done a pretty successful job of explaining why on-disc DLC is not inherently a bad thing. Thank you all for listening. Hope you've enjoyed the video, and if you disagree with me, I am interested to hear your points that you have, but please don't reiterate things that I have said. So, thank you for listening, and I'll see you all next time.